Hello and welcome to the Leading Communities podcast, brought to you by Aspire for You CIC and produced by That's All Media CIC. We're on a mission to understand what it takes to help communities to start caring, keep caring, or care more about an issue.
Hey, my name's Andre. Welcome to Leading Communities podcast, and we're here to talk about men's mental health. I'm here with Varntae.
Yep, so I'm Varntae. I'm a local artist, musician from the area. I've got very strong views about mental health and what we can do to help those kind of things. So happy to have this discussion today, man.
Yeah, and myself, I moved to Walsall back in 2018. I was living here for 5 to 6 years and opened up this space here to try and bring some kind of creative infrastructure back to the town. I've very much struggled and witnessed different scales of mental health crisis within like Walsall. I've experienced things personally and I've seen other people go through it. So very much want to talk more about like the experience of being a person living here, not just a person from the West Midlands living here, but as a young black man that lives in Walsall with connections wider than the town. I want to understand also how it is to be someone that grew up in Walsall, and what that experience has been like, having been here pretty much your whole life and seen the entire change, you know. Yeah, so where do you want to kick it off?
No, cool. I'll build on the back of that then. So growing up in like Walsall and in and around this area, it's a particular kind of place. So for me personally, it's home. I'm not necessarily very negative towards it. However, I'd be lying if I said that it doesn't have that kind of stigma around it. So Walsall's not really seen as your best place. There's poverty, crime rates are quite high in Walsall. A lot of the shops have more recently been closing down, but there's still being like kind of a stigma always around like Walsall and stuff. But unless you're outside of it, you kind of don't realize the extent, if that makes sense. So you're in it, and because it's home, because it's what you're used to, you kind of don't know anything else until you do. And I feel like that's a big part of what is Walsall at the moment, is a sense of a lot of the time people don't know that there's different, I don't want to say better because that's subjective, but people don't know that there's different. Walsall and the lifestyle of Walsall and the energy of Walsall is kind of what a lot of people know. So if you mix in together the kind of poverty that you do see, the crime rates, if you mix that all into like an energy, and it's an energy that you kind of embody, you can then see and understand where bits of mental health issues and these kind of things start to stem in. So that's like a holistic view. Obviously it goes a bit deeper if I was to talk about it on a deeper personal level.
Like, how did you grow up? Like, I'll share a little bit about me because it's nice to like ease in it. I grew up, I was born in Dudley Rose Hospital down in Birmingham, and I grew up pretty much moving around different parts of Birmingham, from Hampstead to Handsworth Wood to eventually to Streatley, from Erdington to Streatley, and then found my way slowly into Walsall. And I didn't recognise what was happening at the time, but essentially it was to do with property prices. You know, that accessibility, it was affordable to live in Walsall. It was affordable and it was easy enough access into Birmingham, but I didn't really pay too much attention to Walsall at the time. I saw it as a place when I grew up as the place you could go to get bargains or to, you know, for a good shop. You know, might even get my school uniforms up here in Walsall. Maybe the butchers, you know. But other than that, being like a family trip or a family visit away, it wasn't the same until I'd spent a few years in the town and I was like, what's really happening here? Why is nothing in the last few years I've done really centrated around like being here in Walsall? Why have I had to leave?
And that's exactly the point. It's almost as if like to get better, or you have to like look elsewhere. You have to go outside of this energy of Walsall. And even like, so going back to the question, like how was I brought up? I was brought up in Darliston. So it's a very communal place. So you've got, I think on the other end of it, there is a sense of community. I think that was a bit more so in the past. I do feel like that has changed, but for me there was that sense of community, like the people in the area like knew each other and stuff, so that adds into that kind of homely like energy and feeling. So it's only when you start to grow up that you start to realize, okay, well, people that are over here, they're like living a bit differently, and they've got this, and maybe I want to get this, and do you know what I mean? And so
it's like a funny place between you don't want to judge, but you also like you're noticing differences, and you're like, what is that?
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna carry on from there, to be honest, because this like brings me into like what I was gonna talk about in terms of the main reasons for mental health. I feel like that point that I was making about you kind of not judging, but you're looking what you want for like better things, like even items. I want them pair of trainers, but we can't get them around it. Do you know what I mean? So on the back end of that, I feel like social media is a big key catalyst to the effects and extents that young people are feeling the issues of mental health. So to elaborate on that, cool. I'll bring it to the terms of men, because that's what we are discussing. Innate within us, there is a sense of competition, and it has to be kind of exercised in a healthy way. Now, if you're looking on social media and you're thinking about material things, I want this trainers, I want that trainers, but you haven't got that access. Before, it was a case of, well, I'm only really competing, quote unquote, with the people in my area. Everyone's the same. Add social media into that mix. You're now competing with the person over there who's born into generational wealth and who can buy whatever they want, but you haven't seen it as that. You've just seen it as, this is an item that I want. And that's why now I genuinely believe, even within Walsall, you'll see kids walking around in Canada Goose coats and their Gucci pouches and all of this. Now, if you look at it overall, that aesthetic as per se wouldn't necessarily fit the energy of Walsall, because it's kind of, if we're looking at it from a poverty perspective. So what's kind of happened for them to need to get there, and what's happening in the middle kind of thing, if you get me?
Do you feel like it gives Walsall a kind of brand? Like that kind of like, you've got a certain aesthetic when people come through, people are wearing, and it's in response to, like you're saying, the conditions.
I do agree.
Yeah. I find that when it comes to that very point in terms of like mental health and social media, I think there's also a disconnection between skills as well, as a way of like having having that sense of self-worth and understanding that you have value.
Definitely.
You cannot really measure that via social media. Men very much need, from my experience, tangible results.
That's it.
And social media doesn't lend to that. It lends to more arts of like persuasion, or you're going to be seen as like, trying to essentially floss in some way or form, innit? And that's not. If we're looking at men, we're not talking boys, we're talking like men, we're talking about maturity as well, and that's a conflict of interest. I find a lot of young men, especially now, especially looking through Walsall, there's a lot of single parent homes, there's a lot of disconnected homes or very fragmented homes, whether people have stayed together or not. And in those experiences, black boys haven't really got like a strong kind of understanding of what a man is, or when they transition into them.
Very true. Very true. Like even like on the back end of that, so like I believe wholeheartedly that the family structure is quite integral to the rest of the structure. I feel like it starts there, because so let's take the single parent households, for example. It takes two like parents, and I'm not saying, like, when I do say this is looking at it ideally. There are obviously circumstances where situations happen and people have made the best of those situations. I will never discredit that. However, looking at it overall, I do believe it takes two parents naturally to make the child, and both those parents contribute different things in the nurture of this child. So naturally, like the mother would have like more estrogen, for example, that can produce milk. There'd be more like nurturing towards the child. Now, for men, they also need that structure, that discipline, sometimes the hardiness and the teaching of what the man aspect of that role is. And I feel like it is a balance. It's kind of like a yin and yang. Without both, there's going to be a little bit of a disbalance. And that's not saying that can't be balanced elsewhere, but I'm finding that, especially in places like Walsall, for example, let's say that there's not that male, we're talking about men, so let's say there's not that male role model within the house, where else is it? And a lot of the times I've found that people that might not necessarily have that in the house but have had a male role model elsewhere, I've got many examples within my own life where I've seen this happen. They've still been able to grasp the lessons that as a man you would want to learn and need to learn to be able to be a quote-unquote man, or what the expectations of a man are, and able to live up to those and handle the pressure of the expectations of man as well. It's been easier for them having that role model. So if you've taken that role model out of it already, if you want to look at it this way, you kind of set back a little bit because you've got to figure out. So it's kind of like you can learn from the mistakes of others, but if those mistakes aren't there to see or to be taught about, then you have to make them first yourself.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, they don't know they're making mistakes. And
that's it.
Or it's, I don't know, like I tend to look at things as everything's very contextual, like it's all choice-based. One choice that might be bad in one moment could be good in another moment. Mm-hmm. But without understanding them, you can't really assess whether you've made a good or bad choice. And that context and awareness for a lot of, I guess, young black men, and, you know, I think for myself, navigating places like Walsall, there are black role models. There actually are some really good role models that are black men that are actually doing really good things in the town. Kevin Davis is doing some good things in the town as well. He's one of the guys that I reached out to early in my journey. But one of the challenges, you know, alongside like these people that are doing this great work is the accessibility, and that's not their fault. It's a systemic design. It's what my friend would call a master stroke. Mm-hmm. It's called. There will be very few of us, and we'll have very limited time and very limited resources. And so, for us, where I think we very much are more akin to, and like we're healthier in environments where we're facilitated and we can be together, mm-hmm. and we can learn together. We don't get those opportunities. There's no spaces for that.
I do agree.
You know, it's what led me to, like, I'd spent maybe 2 or 3 years from 2018 doing what was called like placemaking work around different towns and cities. So we'll be running labs around what's the future of this town or location, mm-hmm. Working with different artists, working with community groups, and trying to work out how places could better suit the residents there. And I was living in Walsall, and I was like, there's nothing here, you know. There's spaces, a lot of them dormant. Why are they dormant? There's a huge history of, like, you know, drug abuse and alcohol abuse. It doesn't end. There's licensing and there's structures in place that facilitate that to continue and perpetuate.
I agree.
And that's unfortunate because it's what I understood from the work I did is, and me coming from a design background, is that every town and city has like a brand or an identity.
That's the word I was going to use. You carry on, yeah.
And like that's, for me, my experience is often defined by the urban culture. That's what people recognize and are familiar mm-hmm. with. They look for the colors, they look for all the indistinct, you know, nuances that all the polished buildings don't really offer. They mm-hmm. only offer structure. You know, that's a safe place, but where's the stuff I want to see?
Exactly.
You know? And it's hard because there's not a lot of resources placed towards or supporting of our culture, and to make sure that we can facilitate spaces like this that can help us grow community and build up the brands of these places.
Exactly that. And I think you touched on a few things that was important then. So like one of the first things that like stuck out for me is you've come like from externally kind of into Walsall and you've lived here for a while, and one of the first things you picked up was there's nothing here. So if you live here and that becomes, so we was talking like off camera, there's a concept called the self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's the idea that if there's a label and if it's perpetuated long enough, that whoever that label is attached to, they start to adopt the properties and principles of what that label is. So for example, within school, if you were to tell a student, you're not really you're in this set, you're not going to do better than this, 9 times out of 10, they're probably just going to stay at that cap because they've adopted that label. Now, if you take that to a bigger stage, what is the identity of Walsall? Now, already you've come from an external into Walsall and said there's nothing here. We've kind of been raised with that identity of there's nothing here for us. What's Walsall's plan for us?
100%.
There's not a plan for us.
As you said, it starts in the home, right? Like, home is by design where you're going to work out what you can do in the world. I grew up in many different houses. I grew up in one little flat, and there was almost like a maisonette on. It was Handsworth, Hunton Road, one of those really dark buildings with no windows on either side because there were terraces. I remember that space, and I don't remember feeling like that was a great space to grow up in. Not just because of the design of the space, the lack of light, but just the fact that I couldn't really imagine what else existed.
And it's
the fortunateness of, and also like the trauma of having to continually moving from different houses. I had that experience to say, okay, there's opportunities outside. And if you can reimagine how you think about the inside of your home and those spaces, you can maybe potentially look outside.
Definitely.
But if you don't feel you've got the power to have those conversations or the connections to the right people to influence a decision, you kind of feel stuck at that point.
Exactly that. And then even like trying to intervene and like have these conversations, it's hard because to even change someone's habit, it takes 30 days. Mm-hmm. So you have to kind of be consistent enough to be able to have these conversations with them over a specific amount of time for it to even have the intended effect. Now, with the lack of resources, with the lack of space to be able to come together communally and do things like this, and with the lack of funding, we can understand why it's a challenge, and more so why it's a challenge that seems to be getting worse if you are observing it. It's because we're kind of trying to attack it at points where it's already getting worse and worse. So if that kind of makes sense, I feel like we're already at a point now where
you're saying we need early intervention with it, and
exactly that.
The thing is, it's like, where's it going to come from now? I see a lot of mental health programs that are like developed as well. Like I'm part of the One Walsall CVS, as well as I support the Towns Fund in terms of Space Hive Walsall. So there's loads of initiatives that are being developed around mental health. Mm-hmm. The audience groups that I tend to see in those spaces tend to be older than us. Like, they don't tend to be young black men that enter those spaces, and it's generally because they don't really appeal to us.
That's true.
There's not really, we like to maybe facilitate our mental health in better ways, like creatively, you know, or like physically, whether it be through sport or going somewhere, you know, some kind of adventure or something.
Exactly.
I think there's not really the destinations that we need in Walsall where young black men can feel safe. There are a few of those spaces which are probably the gyms, you know.
It's true.
You know what I mean?
It's
just
true.
The gyms or the basketball courts. I've seen a few people down in those places, but generally you're very much isolated from a lot.
And then going back onto what you were saying as well about the earlier intervention, and it's not really appealed to us.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to that identity kind of thing as well. Me as the young person, not me specifically, but let's say I'm younger than I am now and I'm going through whatever. If I can't identify with the person or like the scheme that's trying to say, oh, we'll help you in, like, you're gonna struggle to even get me in the door, let alone keep me there. And I feel like that's, like we're saying with the earlier intervention, I feel like it's how we're trying to intervene as well, because in order to gain the attention of a certain demographic, you need to understand the demographic.
I think really we should be like supporting young homes. Like, I actually think young parents, especially young black parents, not per se need training, but need facilitation and support, not invasive, but actually like something that's led by their needs, like, and their assessment. Because a lot, if you look at the household where these ideas form, you said something earlier in terms of like self-fulfilling prophecy. There's something also I believe in psychology where we call it projection, innit?
Yes.
And it's like the voices that we say to the things we say to other people are the voices we tell ourselves, right? And so when you're saying effing and blinding and cussing out somebody, actually that's how your inner voice speaks to you, your spirit, innit? And you can't separate that work that needs to be done on an internal level, which for kids, as they take on, they don't understand the difference
at all. And so communication is very important. And like you're saying, I feel like that communication does start with yourself, because if you can't communicate through your negatives and positives that are going on inside, it's going to be very difficult to communicate that with someone else and help them to communicate through theirs as well.
My parents, they have their levels of emotional intelligence, but ultimately, me also being a parent, understanding that you learn and develop that over time, which means that I've only got so many lessons that I taught my son at when he was 2 versus now, how old he is. So and that's because I've grown as a person, whereas you've got to understand in some way or form, we're all dealing with lessons that we're learning and we're transferring knowledge. So there's never going to be like a clean or perfect answer to how we structure society or how we deal with mental health and all of those things. But if the parents have done the work, that means the environment can change in a home.
Very true.
Which means that the kids can enjoy an environment where they're better understanding of emotions, their own emotions, and so they can better, handle their mental health later on in life.
Very true.
What I found is that I grew up in a household where there was acts of violence, there was acts of outburst at times, which means that for some of my siblings, they struggled with emotions, and they struggle to deal with different circumstances, even myself. And that means that without those, because we didn't get the tools when we were younger, we have to go to therapy. Economics of that are difficult for a young black man, £60 minimum an hour.
Do you know what I mean?
So where's the therapy services that we can really connect to, and where we feel like the therapists are going to understand our lens in terms of how we see the world.
Perfect. You said it all perfectly. And then going back to as well, what was it that you were saying about the household? So within the household, there was the outbursts and stuff, and that was it as well. So when we're coming back to it, it's a case of in order for us to be able to tackle this with the parents, I feel like there's a certain stigma attached to the idea of mental health, full stop. And it's a case of, well, how can we tackle the stigma as well? Because we all there wouldn't be a stigma around normal health, and we all health is something that fluctuates. You might be healthy one day, you might be sick another day. It fluctuates.
You know what I think it is? I've been boggling this has been boggling my brain for a minute, because I feel like I've got elements of neurodiversity, and my stepsons do as well. They're actually on the spectrum. And I've also had family members that have gone through mental health crises. And so I've watched different types of mental health in different, circumstances and contexts. And I think that for a lot of it, there's a misunderstanding in terms of what we contextualize as behavior. As in, this is just culture. And this is mental health. And there actually has been so much in terms of black culture that's been standardized as culture, which has actually been a huge mental health crisis that only really being exposed now. And those conversations for a lot of us are embarrassing, because we don't like to air our grievances.
It's true.
But
it's very true.
Yeah, this is it, yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of the starting point. We need to be honest, but at the same time, I do understand.
We need to be safe as well, innit?
Exactly that, and that's why I do mention the stigma. But I do want to kind of break away from the stigma, because, like I was saying, mental health is the same as health, but it's just for your mind. It's going to fluctuate, and just because the term mental health is necessarily used to describe whatever the circumstance may be, that doesn't. What does that mean? It just means that your mind may be a bit unhealthy at this moment in time. Same way you can get healthy in another way, you can do it this way as well. That's all it is. And for us, as people, especially black people, and especially, like you said, we don't want to air our grievances. I feel like we're coming to a point now though, generationally especially, where we're at a point where it's like, okay, we're now starting to understand maybe these behaviours don't need to be perpetuated going forward, because maybe this has been passed down and it is a trauma. Maybe because your parents did this, you thought this was how you raise a child.
Yeah.
Maybe there were elements that were right and elements that were wrong, same with anything. Furthermore, everyone's individualistic. How do you know that you shouting at this kid, this child might actually not be bothered in the way that you feel like that another child might be. However, that's not to say they're still not absorbing it and whatnot, but some people are more sensitive and susceptible to other methods, do you know what I mean?
You know what, that's just what it comes down to me, is like, this is not, when I just touching base on that and just going back to that point around it being like sometimes labelled as cultural things and that have been adopted and just understood as this is just what we do, and then it's not a mental health issue. That's diagnosed in the system, right? We're misdiagnosed often for mental health issues, neurodiversity, autism, all of those things, even in terms of funding and supports for households. But actually it's a human issue. Every single person on this planet's gone through some experience or trauma that's embedded in the way that we behave.
It's facts.
And what we're really admitting is we don't have a very good understanding of like the actual complexity of the mind.
Yep.
and
the effects that, because something that you might take as small, that happened, you don't know the effects that might actually have had on you unless you start to unpack it. And that's why when people do go to therapy and things like that, once they actually start talking, they start to realise a lot of this stuff is from childhood. How often do we, like as grown-ups especially, how often do we revisit our childhood and think, how has that affected me now in the life that I live today? A lot of the answers that people might be looking for would be how that you were, what happened in your childhood, because your first 7 years, that's where a lot of your mental programs for how you view the world and how you operate within the world, that's where it starts. So if you're at home, for example, and you're hearing, can't do this, we can't afford this, we aren't the type of family that can do this, that's going to perpetuate in your mind. And then when you grow up, you're probably going to, subconsciously as well, you probably ain't even going to deep it.
It can manifest as self-doubt.
This is what I mean. And the subconscious mind, like what we absorb and think about consciously and subconsciously are two different things. And I feel like when things are like what has entered us subconsciously, we won't necessarily know the effects that has on us. So that the only reason I bring that up is to relate to childhood and the sense of, like we're saying, I do think that attacking the parent home and really putting some support there probably is the best place to tackle it, because childhood is such an important period in a person's life in terms of the trajectory of the rest of it. I genuinely believe so.
Yeah, I think I just want to kind of know, if you was to like design something in Walsall like to change like men's mental health, what would you create?
Cool. I would attack this from a creative perspective. So people in Walsall might not want to go and read a book, or they might not. So I feel like creative aspect would be the best part. There's things called music therapy and art therapy. Now, I'm a musician, so I can talk about the music aspect. Music, like down to a deeper level, it changes. It has an effect on water, and we are like however percent water. We are majority water. So music scientifically has an effect on how we are as people. So if we start to look at that, because I feel like music's one of those things that's common across the board. There's different ways of music that can appeal to everyone. I'm not saying all music's the same, but there's a form of music, there's an expression of music that's individualistic to that person, how they can express or they can absorb and enjoy. And I feel like not necessarily just music, but you can do that through art as well. I feel like expression is the most important thing in order to build that understanding. But I feel like in order to get that expression out, I feel like we need hubs and places that are going to allow the expression in a way that's not filtered. And when I say filtered, I mean, it has to be safe and honest and open. And if you have a tap and it's like got dirty water, for example, you have to leave that tap running until the dirty water comes out so you can get to the clean water. I feel like it's exactly the same. You might not like what a lot of these people are saying, and
You have to welcome them.
it has to come out. It has to be open and honest before we can get to anything else.
And like, that's dope, you know. You know what I've been thinking? Because I'm a musician too, and I really want to open a jazz bar. Like a private jazz bar, like something where like poor people, like men could go, or like just musicians, artists, but just try and bring back another safe space, because jazz is kind of cool. It's in between, you know, you can kind of bring anyone into that space, but it's not a tacky space in any way. It can feel professional and it can feel, you know, sleek. But I think, yeah, we generally need more spaces where we can actually just, you know, actually just be ourselves and be free, and like warm spaces as well, like buildings that don't leak.
Exactly.
Like there's not a lot of, like, the buildings in Walsall need development, they need work. We're actually in a point in history where if we're not working on these buildings, on these sites, like we're not gonna have the infrastructure that communities need, like people like ourselves need, in order to feel like we're not just workers, right? This isn't just about economics, it's like about lives, right?
That's it.
At the end of the day, we have an experience of living in Walsall that is subpar to many places in the world, and people will leave, even if we try to invite them into like the investment of the town and like what could we do, because they're already planning to go somewhere else. So yeah, I think we need to actually intervene much earlier and give people reasons to stay and to come back.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening in. I've been Varntae.
I'm Andre, and stay tuned to Leading Communities podcast for more.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to keep up to date with all things Leading Communities. You can follow Aspire for You at A4UCIC. To follow That's All Media, search at That's All Media. You can also join us on Facebook at Leading Communities Podcast.